In the shadowed corners of American history, there existed places few dared to speak of, plantations where the value of a person was measured not by their humanity, but by their ability to reproduce. These were not ordinary farms. They were sites built for one purpose, to increase the number of enslaved people after the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed. When ships could no longer bring captives across the ocean, the system turned inward, creating its own means of sustaining labor. The business of human life became a cold calculation, a cycle of birth and sale that transformed generations into commodities. Imagine the sound of chains replaced by the cries of newborns, children born into a world where their fate was decided long before their first breath. Men and women, stripped of choice, were forced into roles they never consented to, their relationships dictated by profit. The masters saw numbers where families saw heartbreak. Each child represented more labor, more wealth, more control. For those trapped within these cruel boundaries, every sunrise carried the weight of uncertainty. Mothers watched their children taken from them, sold before they could even remember their faces. Fathers lived with the pain of knowing their offspring were born not into love, but into bondage. This was the quiet horror behind the plantation's prosperity, a system that turned life itself into an industry. Today, the remnants of this chapter still echo through time. Though the walls of those farms have long crumbled, the memory of their existence lingers in the nation's collective soul. To understand this truth is to confront one of the darkest realities behind the foundation of America. If stories like this move you, if you believe in uncovering the hidden truths of our shared past, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Together, we can keep history alive, so that silence never buries the truth again. In the deep heart of the American South, where the soil was rich and the cotton grew thick, a darker kind of wealth took root, one that was built not from the land itself, but from the bodies of the people forced to work it. To the enslavers, these men, women, and children were not seen as human beings with dreams, fears, or families. They were property, numbers on a ledger, assets to be managed, bred, and sold. Each life was given a price, each child a potential return on investment. The act of birth, something sacred and full of hope in any other world, became part of an economic strategy. The enslaved were not only made to labor in the fields, they were made to produce the next generation of laborers. The cycle was self-sustaining, coldly efficient, and devastatingly inhuman. On the surface, the plantations seemed peaceful, rows of crops swaying in the wind, the rhythmic hum of daily work. But beneath that stillness lay an unspoken truth: every new birth was a calculation, every family a transaction waiting to happen. Plantation owners recorded pregnancies in account books. They tracked lineage the way a breeder might record livestock, ensuring that strength, endurance, and obedience could be passed down for profit. For the enslaved, love was an act of resistance. To form a bond, to care for another person in a world that sought to erase their humanity, was a quiet rebellion. Yet even these fragile moments of tenderness were constantly threatened. Children were born into uncertainty, their futures decided by someone else's greed. A mother could cradle her baby one day and watch that same child sold the next, her cries swallowed by the indifference of commerce. The system thrived on this cruelty. The wealth of an entire region depended on the ability to reduce life to numbers. Owners expanded their estates, bought more land, and counted more bodies. And while they spoke of progress and prosperity, the true cost of that progress was paid in generations of broken families and stolen identities. Still, within the hearts of those enslaved, the ember of humanity refused to die. They sang songs that carried memory and hope. They told stories to their children about freedom, about a world where no one could be owned. Even in the face of unspeakable control, they found ways to hold on to dignity. Looking back now, it's hard to comprehend how such cruelty could be justified, how people could look upon another human being and see only profit. But to understand this chapter of history is to face the uncomfortable truth, that the foundation of much of America's wealth was built not just on labor, but on the deliberate exploitation of human life itself. Their stories remind us that freedom was never given, it was fought for, dreamed of, and passed down through whispers and prayers. And while the ledgers of the past may have recorded their worth in dollars, history will remember them for something far greater, their unbreakable spirit. In the quiet fields of the American South, life for enslaved women carried a burden far heavier than chains or labor. Beneath the shadow of the plantations, where every sunrise brought the same rhythm of toil and control, there existed another layer of cruelty, one that invaded the most private corners of their existence. These women were not only forced to work the land but were also denied control over their own bodies. Their futures, their choices, even their ability to love, were dictated by those who saw them not as people, but as means to an end. When the transatlantic slave trade came to an end in the early 1800s, the enslavers faced a new dilemma: how to sustain their labor force without buying from abroad. Their answer was chillingly practical: they would make more of what they already owned. And so, the act of childbirth, which should have been a symbol of hope, became part of a system of exploitation. Women were often forced into unions not of affection, but of calculation. Men were selected for their size, strength, or endurance, as though human beings were part of a breeding chart. Overseers would decide who should be paired together, without a word of consent or consideration for the feelings of those involved. It was a process stripped of love, filled only with the echo of commands and the heavy silence of those who had no choice. Some of these women were young, barely past girlhood, yet were expected to bring new life into a world that denied them their own. Their pain, both physical and emotional, was buried under the indifference of those who saw profit in their suffering. And when a child was born, that joy was poisoned by fear that the baby would be taken, sold, or sent away before it could even speak its first words. Men, too, were caught in this web of cruelty. Those chosen for their physical traits were reduced to tools, their humanity erased. They were ordered to father children not for love, but for productivity. The pain of being separated from partners or offspring was as deep as the lash, but it was a wound the world refused to see. Despite these horrors, enslaved women found ways to reclaim small fragments of themselves. In whispered prayers, secret songs, and moments of defiance, they held on to something powerful, the belief that they were more than what the system tried to make them. Some resisted silently, hiding pregnancies or using knowledge of herbs to protect themselves. Others comforted one another, forming bonds of sisterhood that helped them endure the unendurable. These acts of quiet strength often went unnoticed by those who held the power. Yet they were the seeds of resilience that survived long after the fields went silent. For every life that was controlled or manipulated, there was also a spirit that refused to break, a reminder that humanity can persist even in the darkest places. Today, when we look back on that time, it is vital to remember not just the cruelty of those acts, but the endurance of those who lived through them. They carried within them a strength born of unimaginable pain, and through their endurance, they preserved the fragments of dignity that history once tried to erase. Their stories are not just tales of sorrow, they are lessons in courage. They remind us that even when a person's freedom is stolen, their will to survive, to protect their identity, and to dream of a better world can never truly be taken. Across the American South, the fields stretched endlessly, cotton, tobacco, sugarcane swaying under the burning sun. To the casual eye, it looked like a land of prosperity, its wealth born from hard work and fertile soil. But beneath that illusion lay a deeply rooted system, one not built merely on labor, but on control, calculation, and human suffering. The practice of forcing enslaved people to reproduce was not an isolated cruelty. It was a cornerstone of an entire economic and social structure that depended on keeping an entire population in bondage. From Virginia's sprawling plantations to the river valleys of Mississippi, every aspect of the Southern economy was intertwined with this system. Enslaved people were more than laborers, they were the foundation upon which fortunes were made. The more enslaved individuals a plantation had, the greater its wealth and influence. And when importing new captives from across the ocean was no longer possible, plantation owners looked inward for their solution. They turned to what they called natural increase, a term that masked a brutal reality. It meant turning human lives into a form of self-replenishing capital. The South became an intricate web of trade routes, auctions, and financial exchanges all built on this principle. Children born into slavery were counted as assets from the moment they took their first breath. Families were recorded not by name but by number, each person another line on a balance sheet. Bankers, traders, and politicians all played their part, investing in this machinery of exploitation. The system was self-sustaining, perfectly designed to ensure that every life served the economy's endless hunger for growth. Beyond the fields and the slave quarters, this logic seeped into every layer of society. Churches preached obedience, twisting scripture to justify inequality. Newspapers and public officials spoke of progress and prosperity without acknowledging the human cost beneath it. Even those who claimed moral discomfort often benefited indirectly, through the cotton that clothed them, the sugar that sweetened their tea, the tobacco that filled their pipes. The entire region prospered because of this calculated cruelty, and few dared to question it. But not everyone looked away. Within this world of control, there were voices, both enslaved and free, that dared to challenge the narrative. Some secretly taught others to read, passing on knowledge that could one day lead to liberation. Others risked their lives to escape, carrying their stories northward, where they became witnesses to a truth that polite society refused to confront. Still, the power of the system was immense. Laws were crafted to protect it, making sure that even generations born long after the first ships had docked would remain bound to the same fate. Plantation wealth built universities, towns, and industries, all financed by a structure that treated people as property. Yet within the silence of those vast southern landscapes, a quiet defiance endured. Songs sung in the fields carried messages of faith and resistance. Families torn apart by force found ways to remember one another, through names, through stories, through hope. Even as the system sought to erase their humanity, the enslaved kept their spirit alive, passing it from one generation to the next. Looking back, we see that this was never just the story of individual cruelty, it was the story of an entire civilization built upon it. It shows how greed can disguise itself as progress, and how a society can convince itself that injustice is necessary for prosperity. But history, with all its weight, still whispers the truth: no system built on suffering can stand forever. The voices once silenced in the fields now echo through time, reminding us that humanity, even when suppressed, will always rise again. There was no greater sorrow in the life of the enslaved than the breaking of a family. On plantations across the South, love and kinship were fragile things, precious, yet always under threat. A mother could hold her child close one day and watch helplessly as that same child was taken from her arms the next, sold to another plantation, another master, another fate. Fathers, brothers, and sisters were scattered across states, torn apart by an economy that valued human life only for its labor and profit. These separations were not rare or accidental. They were part of a system carefully designed to control and sustain the economy of slavery. Every sale, every auction, every forced march to a new plantation was another transaction in a network that turned grief into commerce. Families became collateral in a market where emotion had no place. The cries of those left behind faded into the rhythm of work, swallowed by the demands of production. Imagine the silence after an auction, the sound of footsteps on dusty ground, the clinking of chains, the faint echo of a child calling for a parent who would never return. For many, this was the beginning of a lifelong ache, a wound that could not heal. Enslaved people were forbidden from legally marrying or claiming family rights, so their bonds existed only through shared love and memory. And when those bonds were broken, they had no protection, no legal voice to protest. For plantation owners and traders, these separations were merely business. Children were counted as future labor, young men as strength, young women as both workers and potential mothers of more enslaved children. Each life had a value attached to it, measured in dollars, bushels, or acres. The humanity of the enslaved was erased by the cold arithmetic of profit. But within that suffering, the enslaved found ways to hold on to identity and dignity. They carried family stories in their hearts, whispering the names of lost loved ones so they would not be forgotten. They sang songs that held messages of remembrance, songs that spoke of a day when no one could be sold or separated again. In their faith, their resilience, and their shared strength, they preserved a sense of belonging that no overseer could take away. Even after being torn from their families, many searched for one another. There are accounts from the years after emancipation of mothers posting newspaper ads, calling out for children they had lost decades earlier. "I am searching for my son," one might read, followed by a name, a place, and a fragment of hope. Those ads were more than desperate messages, they were proof that love had survived the unthinkable. The breaking of families was not only a personal tragedy, it was a weapon of control. By dividing loved ones, enslavers weakened the chance of rebellion or unity. Yet in doing so, they underestimated the power of memory and the endurance of human connection. Generations later, the echoes of those broken families still resonate. The trauma of separation, the struggle to reclaim identity, and the determination to preserve dignity all left their marks on history. But through it all, the people who endured found ways to resist simply by remembering, by surviving, and by passing their stories down. Their pain reminds us that behind every number in a ledger was a name, a voice, and a heartbeat. And while the system that sought to erase them has long since fallen, their humanity endures in every story told, every song remembered, and every act of courage that kept their legacy alive. In the world of slavery, power reached even into the most intimate corners of life. For enslaved women, the cruelty they endured went beyond forced labor in the fields or the endless hours of work in the house. They lived under a system that denied them ownership of the one thing every person should control, their own body. Every part of their existence was dictated by others, where they worked, when they rested, who they could see, and in many cases, even when they would bear children. These women carried a double burden, both racial and gendered. In the eyes of those who claimed ownership over them, they were not seen as women deserving of respect or protection, but as possessions to be used for labor and reproduction. The same system that turned human lives into property also turned motherhood, intimacy, and womanhood into tools of profit. Behind the polished facades of plantation houses, a darker truth lingered. Many enslaved women were forced into situations where refusal was not an option. Overseers, traders, and owners wielded complete control, and the imbalance of power left no room for resistance. The violence they endured was not only physical but psychological, a constant reminder that they had no say over what happened to them. Some women were forced to bear children whose very births were seen as additions to the estate's wealth. A child born into slavery automatically became the property of the enslaver, increasing his assets without any cost. For the women, this turned pregnancy into a source of both sorrow and fear. What should have been a moment of life and hope became another form of captivity, a reminder that even the bond between mother and child could be broken at any moment. Yet even in the midst of this unbearable reality, many enslaved women found strength that defied their circumstances. They formed deep bonds with one another, offering support, protection, and shared understanding. They passed on songs and spirituals that spoke of endurance and hidden hope, using music as a quiet act of defiance. Their ability to find moments of grace and humanity, even while surrounded by cruelty, was itself an act of resistance. In the quarters where they slept, stories were whispered, stories of freedom, of ancestors, of faith that one day justice would come. Some women used the knowledge passed down through generations, herbal remedies and protective rituals, to try to regain a small sense of control over their own lives. Others risked punishment to protect their children or to help others escape. Every act of survival, no matter how small, was a declaration that they were more than what the world tried to make them. The trauma they endured did not end with them. It rippled through generations, shaping the lives of those who came after. But their courage also passed down, becoming part of a legacy of strength and resistance. Today, when we remember the history of slavery, it is impossible to tell the story of freedom without acknowledging the suffering and resilience of these women. They endured the unimaginable, yet through their endurance, they kept alive the essence of humanity in a world that tried to erase it. Their voices, once silenced, now echo through history. In their memory, we are reminded that strength is not the absence of suffering, it is the will to rise despite it. Their story is not just one of pain, but of endurance, faith, and the unbreakable power of the human spirit. When freedom finally came, it did not erase the generations of pain that had already taken root. The Emancipation Proclamation may have broken the legal chains, but it could not undo the invisible ones that lingered deep within families and communities. For centuries, people had been separated, sold, and stripped of their identities. Those scars did not fade with the stroke of a pen, they were carried forward, quietly shaping the lives of those who came after. Across the South, newly freed families searched desperately for one another. Mothers walked from town to town clutching old scraps of paper with names written in trembling hands, hoping to find the children who had been taken from them years before. Husbands and wives who had been separated by sale met again as strangers, unsure whether to mourn or celebrate. Freedom, though precious, came with the painful realization that so much had already been lost. Communities rebuilt themselves from fragments. People created new names, new family lines, and new traditions to fill the gaps left by history. Yet underneath that rebirth, there was a quiet, inherited grief, a collective ache passed from one generation to the next. The trauma lived not only in memory but in the rhythms of daily life, in the fear of separation, in the caution of trusting others, in the unspoken lessons taught by parents to their children about survival in an unequal world. Even after emancipation, freedom was fragile. Laws changed, but the hearts of society did not. The same systems that once controlled bodies now sought to control opportunity, through labor contracts, segregation, and discrimination. The promise of equality remained distant, and the weight of the past pressed heavily on every attempt to move forward. For many families, the struggle was not only to live free but to learn what freedom truly meant. Elders told stories of endurance, of those who had survived the worst and still managed to build something lasting. They taught their children resilience through song, prayer, and storytelling. Within those oral traditions lay both pain and pride, the pain of what had been endured, and the pride of what had been overcome. These stories became the spiritual inheritance of a people determined never to forget, and never to be defined solely by suffering. But trauma is a silent traveler. It passes through generations, reshaping how people see themselves and each other. Some wounds never fully healed, they transformed into caution, mistrust, and, at times, silence. Yet even in that silence, there was strength, a refusal to let the cruelty of the past erase the humanity of those who lived through it. Over time, that resilience evolved into culture, art, and community. Music born from sorrow became songs of hope. Traditions once suppressed grew into celebrations of identity. Out of centuries of oppression came a profound sense of unity, a shared understanding that survival itself was an act of defiance. Today, the echoes of that inherited pain still shape lives and communities. The struggle for equality, justice, and belonging continues, not as a new story but as the latest chapter in one that began long ago. Yet with every generation, the memory of those who endured serves as both burden and blessing, a reminder of the cost of freedom and the courage it takes to keep holding on to it. The legacy of that endurance is not only one of trauma but also of triumph. It is the story of people who, despite being denied everything, built something lasting, families, faith, and an unbreakable spirit that continues to define their descendants today. In the grand narrative of American history, certain chapters are whispered rather than spoken. Among them lies a truth so dark, so deeply buried, that many have never heard its name, the existence of slave breeding farms. These places, hidden beneath the language of property and profit, were not figments of rumor, they were real institutions built to sustain an economy dependent on human bondage. Yet today, they are nearly absent from the pages of textbooks, omitted from classroom lessons, and rarely acknowledged in the collective memory of a nation. This silence did not happen by accident. After the end of slavery, there was an unspoken agreement across generations to forget, to smooth over the cruelty, to reshape the past into something less uncomfortable. The brutality of labor camps could be explained away as economic necessity, but the calculated breeding of human beings to maintain the slave population struck at something deeper, something too disturbing to face directly. And so, this truth was quietly erased. But history cannot be silenced forever. Beneath the surface of the American South lie the remnants of those forgotten places. Fields where children once played now cover the grounds where lives were forced into existence for profit. Old plantation houses, preserved for tourism, often tell stories of architecture and wealth but leave out the most painful details, the stories of the people who were never meant to have their humanity recognized. When the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in the early 1800s, the demand for labor did not disappear. Instead, the system turned inward. Enslaved women and men became the new source of supply. Some plantations began to function as breeding centers, where reproduction was controlled as carefully as any crop. Records were kept, profits calculated, and families torn apart in the name of economic survival. Yet, in the way history has been taught, this part of the story is often left behind. Schoolbooks speak of plantations, of emancipation, of war and freedom, but not of the deliberate creation of human life for profit. The silence surrounding this truth has shaped how generations understand slavery. Without it, the full depth of suffering, and the systems that sustained it, remain hidden. For those descended from the enslaved, this silence has another cost. It robs them of understanding their own history, of knowing where they come from and why certain traumas still echo through time. The absence of this truth in public memory is itself a continuation of erasure. To forget these stories is to deny the humanity of those who lived them. Yet across the country, scholars, activists, and descendants have begun to uncover what was once buried. Through letters, bills of sale, and oral histories, they are piecing together the reality of what happened. They are speaking the names of the forgotten, bringing their stories back into light. It is a painful process, but a necessary one, for silence protects no one but those who benefit from forgetting. To remember is not to dwell in the past, but to give voice to those who were never allowed to speak. It is to acknowledge that history is not a simple tale of progress, but a tapestry woven with pain and endurance. The story of slave breeding farms is not just about cruelty, it is about the capacity for people to survive even when the world tried to strip them of everything. The silence may have lasted for generations, but every truth eventually finds its way to the surface. And when it does, it forces us to ask not only what happened, but why we chose to forget. The past never truly disappears, it lingers, shaping the world in quiet and powerful ways. Though the days of slavery and the breeding farms have long since passed, the shadow they cast still stretches across modern America. The systems built to control, divide, and dehumanize did not vanish overnight, they evolved, finding new forms in the structures of society that remain today. What began on plantations centuries ago continues to echo in schools, neighborhoods, and courtrooms, subtle, yet undeniable. After emancipation, freedom came without foundation. Those once enslaved were left with nothing, no land, no compensation, no safety from the prejudice that had defined their existence. The very laws that had once enslaved them transformed into new barriers, labor contracts that trapped them in poverty, discriminatory housing policies, and a justice system tilted against them from the start. The wounds of slavery did not heal, they hardened into patterns that shaped generations. Over time, the economic advantage built from centuries of unpaid labor became the backbone of American wealth. The descendants of those who profited from the system inherited property, education, and opportunity. The descendants of those who suffered inherited the opposite, generations of exclusion and inequality. Even today, the wealth gap, access to education, and health disparities trace their roots back to those early injustices. The soil that once grew cotton still bears the imprint of who was allowed to prosper and who was not. But beyond the material, there are deeper, quieter scars. The trauma of forced separation, exploitation, and control wove itself into the cultural memory of Black America. It shaped how families were built, how communities protected themselves, and how trust was learned, or withheld. The legacy of survival in the face of systemic oppression bred resilience, creativity, and strength, but it also left a mark that cannot be erased simply by laws or time. In the modern world, the echoes of those old systems appear in new forms: subtle biases in hiring, uneven access to justice, the geography of poverty, and even the way history itself is taught. The collective silence about the full story of slavery, including the breeding farms, has allowed many to believe that the past is disconnected from the present. But history does not work that way. The foundation of inequality was laid long before our time, and its structure still stands, even if its appearance has changed. Yet, within this legacy lies not only pain but also power. The same communities that were once silenced have become the keepers of truth, telling stories once buried and demanding that history be seen in full. Through art, education, and activism, they reclaim what was taken, not only identity but the right to define their own narrative. Every generation faces a choice: to ignore the past or to confront it. To look away is to allow its influence to continue unchecked. To face it is to understand how deeply the roots of inequality run, and to begin the work of change. The story of America cannot be told honestly without acknowledging that its prosperity was built alongside its greatest injustices. The legacy of slavery and its practices still shapes the present, but acknowledging it offers a chance for transformation. By listening to the silenced voices, by teaching the truths long hidden, society moves closer to the justice that was once denied. The past is not gone, it lives in the air, in the soil, and in the stories we choose to tell. And only by facing it fully can the future finally begin to heal. As we close this chapter of history, it becomes clear that understanding the hidden past is more than an academic exercise, it is a necessary step toward seeing the world as it truly is. The stories of those enslaved, their suffering, and their resilience are not distant relics, they are threads woven into the fabric of society, shaping the inequalities, prejudices, and challenges that persist today. To ignore them is to deny the depth of human endurance and the roots of systemic injustice that continue to affect communities across the nation. Looking back, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what was endured. Families torn apart, bodies treated as commodities, and the relentless pursuit of profit at the cost of human dignity, all of these realities demand recognition. But beyond acknowledging the cruelty, there is an equally important lesson in the courage and resilience of those who lived through it. Despite being stripped of freedom, identity, and hope, they found ways to survive, to resist, and to preserve their humanity. Their strength becomes a guide, showing us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can endure. Understanding this history also challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about the present. The systems and attitudes that arose from slavery were not erased with emancipation, they evolved, embedding themselves in laws, social norms, and economic structures. By tracing the origins of inequality, we gain insight into why disparities persist and why some voices remain marginalized. This awareness is not meant to instill guilt but to inspire responsibility, to encourage each of us to engage with history honestly and to act in ways that promote justice, equality, and empathy. Acknowledging the past also empowers us to give voice to those who were silenced. It reminds us that every story matters, that every life deserves recognition, and that healing begins when we refuse to let these experiences be forgotten. By learning and teaching these truths, we not only honor the resilience of those who endured unimaginable hardships, but we also build a foundation for a more informed and compassionate society. History, after all, is not simply a record of events, it is a guide for the choices we make today. As we reflect on these stories, it is our responsibility to carry them forward, to challenge misinformation, and to ensure that future generations understand the full scope of what occurred. Only by confronting the shadows of our past can we hope to illuminate a path toward genuine equality and justice. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more insights into the truths that history books often leave out. May the lessons of the past guide us toward a better future, and to all of you watching tonight, sleep well, knowing that the voices of the past are remembered and honored.